Prime Minister returned this week from a tough and sometimes dangerous tour of the Tokelau Islands. Tokelau is New Zealand's last dependent territory, which means in effect it's the northernmost part of New Zealand. The 3 atolls are so tiny that altogether they cover an area of only 10 square kilometres. Reporter Carol Archie accompanied Mr Longy on his visit, which was the first there by a New Zealand Prime Minister.
It's just an elderly Pacific Island cargo ship loading basic supplies in Apia for 1,600 people who live on 3 remote atolls near the equator. But it was to be David Longy's home for a week and a chance for him to experience the sense of separation the islanders feel from the rest of the world. And he chose to travel the way they have to. The departure was not only the first visit to Tokelau by a New Zealand Prime Minister, but also the first sea voyage by a New Zealand Prime Minister for 25 years.
Don't go off the end. That's it, you'll go off the end in a minute.
Mr Longy paid for his 2 sons to come too.
You'll be sick tonight, that man said.
By morning, the seas were moderating after a rough night in the wake of a hurricane. But Mr Longy had gained his sea legs enough to visit the ship's Tongan master.
We're going to introduce the boys to you, Roy.
His 13-year-old son, Roy, had fulfilled the prediction of seasickness, but his brother, 11-year-old Bryron, was bearing up.
Master.
Even here, there's no escape. A message is passed on from Wellington through Apia that the United States wishes to send a warship on a visit to New Zealand in March. The privations of living aboard another vessel are receiving more of David Longy's attention. By the end of the trip, there would be 250 passengers sleeping on the deck and a shortage of fresh water. Day 2 and Whakaofo first stop on the journey. Leaders of all 3 atolls sail out to greet their guest. David Longy must face 6 trips in this twin-hulled boat to the shore and back during his visit. The passage from the deep ocean through a narrow channel in the reef goes safely this time. It's a Tokelauan custom to feed travellers before they even get to shore, a necessity in ancient times after voyages across vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. And an ancient chant for warriors at sea is a feature of the Tokelauan welcome ceremony. Not kava, but a simple drink from a coconut is presented to special guests. Through an interpreter, an elder, Te Ata Tinielu, wasted no time telling Mr Longy of Tokelau's desire to remain part of New Zealand. Because of its very limited resources, it feels it's not ready for independence, and David Longy has promised to be guided by the elders on the issue.
Perhaps in the long term, perhaps if this relationship is continued and through a gradual process of political education, perhaps in the very distant future, Tokelau might attain some degree of self-determination and political autonomy.
Tokelau isn't ready to paddle its own canoe politically yet, but its people were determined to see that Mr Longy knows what he's doing, and prove it also to his son Roy. Here was the victor, but the prize was an unexpected dunking over the side of the canoe.
It's almost like a revival.
Mr Longy was in for another surprise too.
Good heavens, look at that. Built along the same lines too.
This school bus was a reminder that boats are the only vehicles on the crowded island of Whakaofo, that there are no telephones, very limited electricity, and entertainment is what you make for yourself. The village always divides into 2 groups to compete with each other for the best performance. David Longy showed no favouritism. Then it was back to Avondale, heading further north.
You made a dramatic recovery, Bryron. I just stopped eating about half a dozen pieces of bread. If anyone wants half of my steak, they can have it. You want it? Well, take it. I never do on a quinoa, but it's all right here.
Evening on day 4, and Tokelau's largest atoll, Nukunonu, is sighted. This is to be the Prime Minister's safest transfer from the ship and the calmest reef crossing. A new kind of traditional welcome on Nukunonu. Day 5 begins in the island's biggest building. Tokelauans are devout Christians. Nukunonu's church is Roman Catholic, but the other atolls are predominantly members of the London Missionary Society. Another building, named after David Longy, is to be officially opened on this morning. The new wing will house pupils from Form 2 to 4 at Nukunonu's school.
Yeah.
Education has brought worries for elders like Palihau Leone. His efforts to teach the young ancient chants and dances earned him the Queen's Service Order. But he says traditions have already been lost and must not be further eroded by outside influences. The old man speaks through an interpreter.
We as elders in Tokelau ought to get the young people of today to try to maintain the kind of things that we've been trying to teach them over the last 20 or so years, so that they will be the parents of the future, they will be the elders of the future, so they will be able to tell their kids and children about the kind of things that are important for Tokelau.
Later at lunch, David Longy was to see the best side of subsistence living. Agriculture is so restricted on these coral atolls that coconuts and fish are still the key to survival. Chicken and pork sometimes relieve that simple diet, but fishing is a major communal activity for a communal need. Sticks frighten the fish into a net close to shore. Everyone will get a fair share of the catch. The fish, so unlike ours, bear exotic names like ume, nanue and ngahu ngahu. Mr. Longy is a keen swimmer, even in less inviting waters than these. But the next day back on board the Avondale, the seas were not so kind. The first whaleboat out to the ship from the last atoll, Atafu, was capsized and its outboard engine lost in the deep. Over walkie-talkies, the elders on shore debated for several hours the wisdom of taking the Prime Minister ashore. But the decision was made, and Mr. Longy, in a dark suit, began making his way down the steps. It proved to be a moment of great danger because the step beneath his feet collapsed and left him hanging momentarily from the ropes. When he was safe aboard, the men on the reef waited anxiously to see there were no more accidents as he came through the narrow reef channel. On shore there was a prayer and a hymn of thanks for his safe arrival, and Mr. Longy, now at the last atoll, was beginning to reflect on his visit.
it is a way of life which has the air of being idyllic. But when you look at the back to it, there's the terrible transport, the rigours of the ship, the hardship of the reef, the unremitting toil. It's just one constant disciplined slog, alleviated by the sheer naturalness and beauty of it.
But it's a lifestyle facing changes. Historically, men have made all the decisions through councils of elders. But those traditions are breaking down because women are beginning to ask for a greater say in Tokelauan affairs.
I don't think women have enough fear. They should have more than what they do now.
What about young people? Do you think that they'll need to participate more in the affairs of government?
Well, it needs encouragement. There are many people, most of Tokelauans, who have been educated and who have been going outside. They learned a lot just from the younger generation.
Even greater changes threaten if the elders continue to talk about the prospects of building an airstrip in Tokelau, although New Zealand is approaching that with great caution.
You make this the haven of the beach comber, the drifter, the dropout guy, the political activist woman, you've really got yourself a potential problem. And that is something that the elders will have to weigh up, not New Zealand.
So an airport is something that will have to be very, very seriously considered.
Yes, and I'm sure they will.
At dawn, a last reminder of the reef's dangers greeted David Longy on a lonely beach at the other side of the atoll. He and his party had made the trip in the dark across the lagoon, first by boat, then wading through the waters by lamplight, and finally through the bush. The Prime Minister was brought here to ensure that his last reef crossing could be made in safe waters. The whaleboat and engine was carried here through the bush during the night also. For the Swiss family Longy, it had been a memorable journey. As for Tokelauans, and elders summed up their feelings with this farewell translated to English.
Mr. Longy, you have indeed honored us with your visit. We call upon the spirit of Tokelau to grant you wisdom to continue your work. As we part, we wish you Godspeed.